Aloha mai kākou and welcome to this next Hawaii Children's Trust Fund training webinar. Today's topic is responding to the needs of children impacted by parental incarceration, and we have two fabulous speakers that I would like to allow them to introduce themselves. And first we have Kukuna Okala. Go for it.
O nauna ka halame kalehua, e halele hua no ia nakano e. O ka uno ia e ano ine e li ane o ka hiki mai. A hiki mai no o ko a hiki puno me ke aloha. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e. Aloha mai kākou, mai Hawaii a i hau a ka aina e aloha. O ka mea mua, first and foremost, we'd like to extend a big mahalo to the Hawaii Children's Trust Fund for inviting Anne and me to present today. And of course, mahalo to all of you for being here with us. My name is Kukuno Kala Yoshimoto, and I'm honored to be presenting today alongside one of my newest friends who comes to us with an unbelievable amount of knowledge and experiences. Director of the National Resource Center on Children and Families of Incarcerated at Rutgers University, Camden, Anne Adelist Eschen. Aloha, Anne. Thank you for being with us. The title of our presentation today, Pehea na Keiki, How Are the Children? Kasarian Ingere, which is a greeting that comes from the Maasai warriors of the African tribe of Kenya, that translates to, are the children well? Or how are the children? The expected response is all the children are well, meaning all are protected, making them our priority and assuring they are growing in a healthy, loving environment. We humbly and respectfully titled today's presentation, Pehea na Keiki, to honor the Maasai people for their beautiful insight that clearly underscores the priority the culture puts on the well-being of its most vulnerable members, and to remind us of our kuleana, our responsibility and privilege really to do the same. Before we begin, we humbly offer this land acknowledgement of Hawaii as an indigenous space whose original people are Kanaka Maoli. We also want to take the time to acknowledge the indigenous lands from which each of you joins us and the original people of those lands. Today we gather wisdom and inspiration from our kupuna, our elders, to our keiki, our children, to share with you all in this space. We continue our efforts and commitment to diversity, ethnic understanding, and cultural awareness of all the families of Hawaii and beyond, to be responsive and inclusive of the diverse needs of the community while honoring the values, practices, and principles of the host culture, Native Hawaiians. Quick overview of the agenda for today. We kind of framed it in 5 areas or 5 questions. We'll start with what do we know? We'll move to where are we now? Then to what do we need? And then last but not least, what can I do? And finally, what can we do? So first, we'll start with what do we know? And I'll hand it over now to Anne to kick us off.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. This is a real pleasure for me to be part of this. First of all, because your state is one of my favorite places on earth, and I'm sure people say that all the time, but I truly mean it in every way. And I also did a lot of work related to children with incarcerated parents going all the way back into the late 1990s. And so I'm just thrilled to be back talking with you guys now about the needs and the strategies that can be, you know, the needs of the kids and the families and the strategies that we can implement. But I always want to start with this activity because I want everyone to sort of go and be introspective. So the next slide, please. I want everybody to take a look at the picture, and because we have a wonderfully large group, we're not going to ask for answers, but I want you to think about your answer and ask yourself the question, what do you see? And when I show this picture, most people say, proud dad. But the fact is, you do not see a proud dad. You see a man, you see a child. You can imply, you can interpret that the child may be a girl because of the clothing, but not necessarily. The dad or the man, who you can interpret as a dad, is smiling up at the child, and the child has a bit of a determined face. I have to tell you that every once in a while, probably about every third time I show this picture, someone says, pushy dad. Now, I don't see a pushy dad. I don't see a person pushing the child beyond his or her limits. But if someone had a pushy dad, they may see that in this photograph. And so I always want to start with, Aristotle said that being self-reflective was the beginning of all wisdom. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And so before we do anything with children and families of the incarcerated, we have to understand what our perspectives are, what our biases are, and what we see versus what we interpret. We'll begin there. And now we'll move to some things that we think we know. And the next slide is going to take a look at some numbers. You're going to see lots of numbers out there. We often see 1.7 million. That's because that statistic won't include jails. But if you include jails and prisons and federal penitentiaries, it's about 2.7 million, or 1 in 28 kids. If you include children who ever had an incarcerated parent, not just a snapshot number, the 2.7 million is a snapshot number on any given day, but over 7 million have ever had in their life an incarcerated parent, and over 10 million have had parents under some form of criminal justice supervision, house arrest, probation, parole, community service, any form of criminal justice supervision. So these are the numbers, and I do want to just say one more thing about those numbers. No one counts heads. So we don't have a count. We don't count children when parents go into correctional facilities. We don't ask them about their children for the most part. Some places are beginning to. And so there's a random sampling form of research that's used and a formula. And that's how we get the numbers. Likely then, these are underestimated. Some of the other things that we've gleaned from some of these formulas and random samplings, the next one, is age. And we know that 50% of the kids are age 9 or younger. I think this is also possibly a little fuzzy, because we know that most incarcerated parents are fairly young. They say that the ages are between 25 and 34 for incarcerated parents, but we also have quite a few who are between 18 and 25. And so their children may be younger than this. But the point that this makes that's very important is that over my 43 years of doing this work, we've really focused a lot on programs and practices and policies for school-age kids and teenagers, and not very much on the youngest of these. So we have to really attend to things like home visiting programs and early Head Start and Head Start programs, and how to help those programs best meet the needs of the younger children. And the next one tells us a little bit about who the children live with. And we know that 94% of children with incarcerated parents have incarcerated fathers. And we know that 90% of those kids live with their mothers. And we also know that probably 60% of those kids who live with their mothers when their fathers are incarcerated are not known to any public system. They are kids who live with mom. Mom might have 2 jobs. Mom might be going to school. Mom might be trying to make this all work. Mom may or may not tell anyone about the fact that the other parent is incarcerated. So most children live with their other parent. Then in the second, from the left, the second column, the gray column on the other side. Yeah, that gray column is those children that live with grandparents, and that is children with incarcerated mothers most often live with grandparents. And then the smaller stacks are all other relatives, foster care, and then friends or just other. So the vast majority of these children live with their moms. The next slide. So where are they? And one thing I want to really hammer home is that this is not one monolithic group of families. We must honor the themes and variations culturally, as Sukuna said earlier, but also just variations in how they live and where they live and who family is. We tend to make assumptions about these kids, and those assumptions are often inaccurate. Next. So the forward.us did a study a couple of years ago. It's called Every Second, and you can look at it at everysecond.forward.us. 1 in 2 people in the United States has had an immediate family member incarcerated. So the answer to where are they is they're everywhere. And so I want to tell you about a time that I think it may have been the last time that I visited Oahu. I was there for a meeting that I was speaking at, and I was eating breakfast in my hotel. And I was doing my PowerPoints for the presentation. And a waitress leaned over to fill my coffee, saw my PowerPoints and said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I explained to her, and she kind of walked away pretty quickly and uncomfortably. And a few minutes later, she came back and left a note for me. She handed me a note and she said, "Would you be able to come and talk with me if I take a break?" And I said, "Sure." So she took a break. We went out into the lobby and she told me that her children's father was incarcerated and they were moving him to Nebraska from Hawaii. And she really wanted some help to understand how to work, how to deal with the kids, how to explain it to them. And it just reminded me that the families, the children and families are truly everywhere. And only if you somehow come across them, if you're able to, if it comes up and they talk about it, then but most of the time that's not going to happen. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So mostly everybody wants to know first, how many kids are we talking about? And the next thing they want to know is what is the impact? So I think one of the most important things that's happened in the last few years is that the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which many of you are going to know about, which was, it came about in the 90s. Dr. Spalletti and Anda discovered that adults, middle-aged adults, who had any of these 8 or 7 adverse childhood experiences had higher rates of all kinds of negative health outcomes, including cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, and many, many, many more. And that was in the mid-90s, and the study went sort of unnoticed for quite some time. And these were the adverse childhood experiences: physical or emotional abuse or sexual abuse, alcohol or drug abuse in the household, an incarcerated household member, someone who was chronically depressed or mentally ill, institutionalized or suicidal, a mother who was treated violently, and that kind of got amended to be any violence in the home, and then single parenthood. So these were very 90s kinds of perspectives in some ways. And then in 2005, Nadine Burke-Harris, who is now the Surgeon General for the state of California, she's a pediatrician, and she kind of said, why should we be waiting until people are middle-aged to pay attention to this? We should pay attention to it with the children, which we all thought was fabulous, because now children of incarcerated parents were going to be seen as being traumatized by the incarceration of the parent. And up until then, for 25 years, 30 years, these kids had been seen as the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and they're going to turn out just like their parents, rather than these are kids who have experienced loss and trauma and need to be treated as such. Next slide. And so the reason that ACEs are important is that the cortisol surging that comes with trauma from all of those ACEs causes primarily these behavioral problems: impulse control issues, cause and effect, limited capacity to anticipate consequences, like if I do this, then this will happen, that's just missing for a lot of kids. Predictability is off, the lack of social cueing, emotional regulation is off, calming down, delaying gratification. And then this reciprocal engagement, I talked and you talked and I talked and you talked. All of those things are off with kids who have prefrontal cortex architecture shifting from cortisol, from trauma. So that's a thumbnail of Trauma 101. But having that apply to children with incarcerated parents initially was wonderful. Next slide. Because these kids were, those behaviors were leading to poor school performance and increased dropout rates, and their attachment disruption trauma from having lost their parent was leading to gang involvement and early pregnancy. And self-medicating in the wake of all of this trauma and toxic stress was leading to drug abuse and addiction. And all of those things were starting to be looked at as the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that these kids are going to turn out like their parents, when really they were turning out like children who had experienced, and adults even, who had experienced many, many, many other traumas. Next slide. But then we started to see that we needed to add secondary traumas, especially for children with incarcerated parents. They were at higher risk for bullying and poverty, for peer rejection and experiences of racism, which the American Academy of Pediatrics has so beautifully made that statement 2 years ago about racism being trauma. Extra deaths in families, community violence, food insecurity, and experiences of foster care and juvenile justice system add to this secondary trauma for kids with incarcerated parents. And then the next slide shows us the one study that says that children with incarcerated parents have more adverse childhood experiences than other kids. So they have more things like parental divorce, parental death, and all of the other things that occur, all of those other ACEs happen in clusters more often with children with incarcerated parents. So the ACEs are important, but there was a problem. In the next slide. And the problem was that we were seeing all of these, this is a little bit hard to read, but all of these healthcare issues for kids, ADD, anxiety, obesity, asthma, and they were doubled for children with incarcerated parents. So if you had an incarcerated parent, there was one rate of these diseases, and if you didn't, it was half of that. And the only one that had no impact at all was diabetes. Everything else was doubled if you had an incarcerated parent. So we were pretty sure that the trauma of these ACEs for children with incarcerated parents is really important to pay attention to. Next slide. But this was leading to myths. So the original ACEs were all really focused on trauma that was caused by families. In fact, the CDC called them child maltreatment and family dysfunction. And then about 5 years ago, they shifted it, right before COVID, they shifted it to child abuse and neglect versus household challenges. Changes completely the way, remember the picture activity, the way we interpret it. Family dysfunction and child maltreatment was leading people to do mandatory mandated reporting. You had an incarcerated parent. Well, shouldn't we call in Child Protective Services? No, only if there was evidence of abuse and neglect. Well, aren't these children mostly child welfare kids or mostly abused and neglected? And the fact is, no, only 3% of all children with incarcerated parents in the child welfare system were abused or neglected prior to the parent's incarceration. In fact, most children with incarcerated parents, the child was removed from the home because of caregiver stress when the parent was incarcerated. And as a direct result of the primary caregiver's arrest was the other reason the kids are in foster care, because of placement. The kids needed a place to stay. Most of it was indirect reasons like the reduction of stability, economic, social support, parenting, childcare stress for the caregiver. And again, that's often the mom when the father is incarcerated. And just keep in mind, as we talk about cultural care and cultural and attending to cultural perspectives and needs in everything we do, that there's differential levels of surveillance, monitoring, and policing reported for all families of color, all non-white families basically, have higher levels of surveillance and policing around child welfare than white families do. So the criminal justice involvement becomes a marker. So in other words, if someone is being investigated for a child welfare case and they have a felony in their background, even if it's check fraud, even if it's a non-child related felony, that could go in it goes in the mix as a potential reason that the allegations of child abuse are true. So it just starts a domino effect. And the myth really permeates everything. So parenting classes that are offered in lots of prisons and jails are parenting classes that are designed for parents who abuse and neglect their children, when that's not the majority of people who are in there taking parenting classes. We call them, things like learning to make better choices. Well, a lot of families need to make better choices, but some families made fine choices around their parenting. They made bad choices about some other things, maybe. And so we really have to be clearer about the child welfare population is not exactly the same as children with incarcerated parents. Another myth, which I think everyone hears, is that children with incarcerated parents are more likely than their peers to go to prison or jail. So ask yourself, do you agree or disagree with that? And the next slide. We absolutely know that when we talk about a child losing a parent to incarceration, and we interpret the ACEs literature through the lens of child maltreatment, we say that these are kids that are harmed by their parents. They're better off without them. And then it's really hard for us to promote programs and practices and policies that connect the kids with their parents, because the basic myth is that the parents aren't good for their kids. And the other part of that myth is that if they connect to their parents, then they're going to end up going to prison or jail. And so we want to be sure that the myth about, can we go back to the last slide? This one up. We want to be sure that this myth is challenged, because we have no good research that says that just because they have an incarcerated parent, they will end up in prison or jail themselves. Possibly trauma, possibly racism in the system, and possibly marginalization of families. And then possibly the fact that this myth about the parents not being good for the kids has eliminated one of the best research proven best solutions for healing from trauma for children is their parents. And probably in close to 50% of the cases of children with incarcerated parents, those parents who are incarcerated are in a position to be the buffer to heal from the most damaging aspects of trauma. And that loss becomes very profound and not dismissible if we see it that way. And then visiting programs are seen as essential. So those are the myths that I think we want to address a little bit. I will talk about it a little bit later. And then the next slide. So those are sort of some of the, down and dirty, what we know on the national level. And now I'll turn it over to Kupuna and talk about Hawaii.
Mahalo nui, Anne. Thank you so much. So Anne gave us this kind of big national picture of all the statistics and things we need to know, and I'm going to kind of try to bring it home to Hawaii and kind of share a little bit about our context here. And to start, I want to talk a little bit about the ohana, and then I'll go into the carceral system here in Hawaii. And then I'll go over some reports and policies over the last few decades that kind of had alluded to and helped kind of push us in the right direction. So historically, Native Hawaiians thrived through the generations. Native Hawaiians today are descendants of Polynesian wayfinders who for thousands of years traversed vast oceans using sophisticated navigation systems, which eventually landed them in one of the most remote chain of islands in the world, Hawaii. Native Hawaiians lived for many years isolated from the rest of the world with a viable culture that met the needs of a thriving, industrious, and spiritual people. The word ohana is one example that shows the deep interconnected relationship Native Hawaiians have with the land and with each other. Oha means to sprout or a sprout, or offshoots of the taro plant, which furnish the staple of life for Native Hawaiians. With the suffix na added, ohana literally means offshoots, or that which is composed of offshoots. This term then, as employed to signify the family, has precisely the meaning, the offshoots of a family stock. Kinship in Hawaii extends far beyond the immediate biological family. The terminology of kinship is thought of against the background of the whole community of kith and kin, including in-law and adoptive categories. In the 1,000 years that ensued, Native Hawaiian descendants of those migrations built a thriving, sophisticated culture and a complex subsistence economy based on values of trust, shared responsibility, and communal participation. The ohana still exists as a vital factor in Hawaiian life. Most Hawaiians nowadays adhere in some degree to both the old Hawaiian system and the American way, modified and adapted due to urbanism, education, economic life, individualism, and intermarriage with other races. Is it desirable that it be perpetuated as a social institution and force? If desirable, can it be perpetuated then where it still prevails? And can it be revived where it has lapsed? I thought it was important to kind of provide some context as far as how we view ohana here in Hawaii and how important it is, not just for the immediate biological family, but the larger family as well. Okay, moving on to the carceral system of Hawaii, here in Hawaii. I thought it would be helpful for again, additional context setting, to share an article that I read when we here at Blueprint for Change started work around children of incarcerated parents and incarcerated parents of children. That I found super interesting and beneficial, that helped my understanding of the current criminal justice or criminal legal system as we know it today. So if you folks are familiar with Dr. Radine Kahiolalo Karsula's piece, article she wrote back in 2010 titled A Genealogy of Punishment in Hawaii, the Public Hanging of Chief Kamanawa II. If not, I highly recommend you give it a read. The article can be accessed for free on the Kamehameha Publishing website. And Mai just kindly dropped the link there in the chat for you to access. In short, the article traces a historical route of criminalization and punishment here in Hawaii through the public hanging of Chief Kamanawa II, who is the grandfather of King Kalakaua and Queen Liliuokalani. Through a political lens, the author analyzes how Chief Kamanawa II's execution intersects with his grandchildren's early education and later their acts as constitutional monarchs. This discussion is augmented by an examination of Kamanawa II's ancestors, the Kapu twins, Kamanawa I and Kame'ia Moku, and their place on the Hawaiian coat of arms and seal. Through these stories, the author introduces a framework from which to analyze crime and punishment dynamics here in Hawaii. What emerges is the way that punitive sanctions correlate with the loss of Hawaiian lands and the erasure of cultural, which includes the breakdown of the ohana and political authority. All right, moving on to reports and policies. Bear with me, there's lots of dates and things, so I'll try my best to run through it and make it clear. So to end the first section on what do we know, I'll share a little bit about some of the reports, policies, and projects related to children of incarcerated parents, dating back to the 1970s all the way up to present. The impact of the criminal justice or criminal legal system on children and families here in Hawaii has been studied and reported on extensively during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Alulike, the University of Hawaii Center for Youth Research and Office of Hawaiian Affairs are just a few who took the time and dedicated resources for these studies and reports. In 2005, the Task Force on Children of Incarcerated Parents was established by the legislature and was tasked to develop programs to aid children of incarcerated parents, strengthen these families, and break the cycle of crime and violence within them. The task force was required to submit a report to the legislature and general public 20 days prior to the convening of the regular session of 2008. And Mai so kindly again dropped the link to that report in the chat for you all to access. In 2008, the state of Hawaii enacted guiding principles to be used by state agencies when dealing with children of incarcerated parents. I'll just read a few of these here. Children shall be treated with respect and dignity at all times. The children's safety and care shall be of paramount importance to all involved. The children shall be kept safe and informed at all times of their parents' arrest. Children shall receive proper support during any struggles with the parent's incarceration. Children shall not be judged, blamed, or labeled because of a parent's incarceration. And children shall receive support for the desire to retain a relationship with an incarcerated parent where appropriate. And again, there's a link there in the chat for the guiding principles for you to access. These are just a few of the guiding principles. The full list can be found through that link there. This brings us to 2010 and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs publication of the disparate treatment of Native Hawaiians in the criminal justice system. The findings and recommendations similarly mirrored the reports and findings from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The report led to the creation of the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force in 2011, whose report and findings once again looked and sounded a lot like the previous decade's slew of reports and findings. One of the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force report key findings is prevention and early intervention programs for Native Hawaiians. The children of incarcerated parents are at risk of having a higher rate of interaction with the criminal justice system. Preventative measures such as adequate education and programs for at-risk youth continue to be inadequately funded. One of the recommendations then from the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force report is prevention and early intervention programs for Native Hawaiians, similarly titled, to reduce intergenerational incarceration, resources must be directed towards children of incarcerated parents. The legislature should consider a mandatory educational program for guardians of minors with a parent in prison, similar to the Kids First program currently in place throughout the judiciary. Well, thank you, Mai, for dropping that link also in the chat. So we are now at 2012, where Act 117 passed. And this act asks the state to look at and consider alternative practices to incarceration, specifically mentioning pu'uhonua. What would it look like? Who would need to be involved? How much would it cost, etc. Long story short, nothing really came of that law, but it did prompt a lawsuit because of the inaction from a grassroots community organization who felt, again, the state wasn't doing enough to address this issue. In 2014, Blueprint for Change, along with other community organizations and stakeholders, created the Family Reunification Working Group through our work with the Keiki caucus. The group identified a couple of goals right away, one of which related to data collection, and mentioned that there was no real mechanism to collect data on children of incarcerated parents. So that was one thing that we had accomplished. So in 2015, we were able to pass Act 16, which required the Department of Public Safety to ask 2 questions upon intake statewide. And that's, are you a parent and how many children under the age of 18 do you have? A pilot data set collected in February of that year reported approximately 600 children impacted by parental incarceration in that month alone. While that number may sound high at first hearing of it, but we do believe, as Anne does, believe that the number is low, underreported for a number of reasons, which we could spend a whole other presentation discussing. In 2016, I had the honor and privilege to sit on the HCR 85 Criminal Justice Task Force, who then reported to the 2019 legislature with, surprise, surprise, similar findings and recommendations. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs also put together a summary and key recommendations handout that is available for viewing and or download. And again, thanks, Mai, for dropping all those links there in the chat. 2017, Blueprint for Change was awarded Administration for Native Americans grant to develop and pilot a culturally anchored curriculum designed to reconnect formerly incarcerated individuals to their cultural values, practices, and principles. We worked with the wahine, or the women of Kahaleho Alaho no Na Wahine, and the men of Makano Keakua halfway houses. In short, both pilots were highly successful, and modified versions are still being used today. In 2018, Blueprint for Change was awarded a 3-year Native Hawaiian Career and Technical Education grant to provide career and tech ed workshops, classes, and projects around culture and agriculture to formerly incarcerated individuals, as well as their families. In 2020, we were delighted to have been awarded a 5-year NHCTE, same grant, Native Hawaiian Career and Tech Ed grant, to build upon our previous work. These 2 projects came from the second goal of the Family Reunification Working Group, which was to work with the parents of incarcerated children and their families, again, with an understanding of the importance of and reverence for the whole ohana, or whole family unit. This past legislative session, we were able to finally pass Act 125, which establishes a pilot family visiting and resource center at Waiawa Correctional Facility. We're super excited to be working with the Department of Human Services, Public Safety, and other community organizations and stakeholders to get the visiting and resource center up and running as soon as possible. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a bit. But for now, we will move on to where are we now? And I'll turn it back over to Anne.
It's really exciting to see all that's going on in Hawaii. We are in the middle of a 50-state study looking at all of the 50 states and what is happening at the state level. And we have discovered that you guys in Hawaii are doing and have been doing more than most states. So, you know, that's great. So what I've seen in the last 40 years, you know, when I began, there were a handful of programs that working with children with incarcerated parents, mostly in corrections, visiting and parenting programs. And then the shift came to let's not connect these kids with their parents, because while the concerns for intergenerational violence and crime are real, they really often have a negative downside, which is focusing on keeping the kids not connected to their parents because of the bad influence, quote unquote. So in the 2000s, early 2000s, mentoring programs became the thing. And let's take these kids and give them good role models in the community rather than connecting them to their parents. And then there was another shift. The political winds keep shifting. So next slide. So we moved from awareness to really responding to the need. In the first few decades, it was just awareness of who are these kids and where are they? And then we moved to, well, how do we meet their needs? Not just being aware. And then in that responding initially, it was specific children of incarcerated parents programs to, it was a move from specific programs to addressing the systems that serve them. So instead of just looking at mentoring programs for the kids or after school programs for the kids or writing clubs, which, you know, Pops the Club in Los Angeles is a great writing club at a school district. Specifically, the shift was to addressing the total system. So how does an educational system, a school district, meet the needs better? How does mental health meet the needs better? How does law enforcement meet the needs better? And I really do credit the Obama administration for taking us there and saying, let's take a look at every one of those systems and break them down. The next slide talks about a really important shift in the last maybe 10 years from an academic or professional definition of what the families need to those that are personally impacted, defining the need and finding the solution. And now we're seeing it is just a given that programs developing need to have those that it's about, nothing about us without us. Those that it's about have to be on advisory committees and design committees for services.
All right, sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. So where are we now here in Hawaii? For this section, I thought the best way to share kind of where we are was to uplift and share a little bit about some of the awesome community organizations that do amazing work currently with children of incarcerated parents. And this list is by no means extensive. It's just a few that I'm aware of, and there's a lot more folks doing this work. I know that for sure. So the first one I wanted to highlight is Camp Agape. Camp Agape first started in 2006 and is an annual 4-day event filled with an intentional series of activities and events for children whose parents are in prison. There are now currently 4 Agape chapters, one here on Oahu, one on Hawaii Island, one on Maui, and one in California. Thanks, Mai, for dropping that link in there. The next is Keiki Ka'aina's Strengthening Families Affected by Incarceration program, which serves children and youth with a parent or parents in prison. Family members parents in prison, family members who are taking care of the children or caregivers and youth, and the incarcerated parent. Children, caregivers, and the incarcerated parents interact through mentoring, parenting classes, and parent-child programs designed to help families maintain bonds and children to thrive. The purpose is to strengthen families affected by incarceration so that they may become resilient to their situation. A link there for you in the chat. The next is Hawaii Friends of Restorative Justice, which is an educational entity that works to help individuals and organizations live cooperatively and peacefully. One of their many wonderful programs is the Huikahi Reentry Circles, which is a process designed for incarcerated people, their families, and victims to address the need for reconciliation to prepare for successful reentry. Last but not least, Adult Friends for Youth. Since 1986, Adult Friends for Youth has devoted passion, energy, and resources to provide healthy alternatives to gang membership, violence, and school failure. Adult Friends for Youth currently serves youth who are engaged in violent and destructive behaviors. Without proper intervention, these youth may be a burden on society with higher risks of incarceration, unemployment, homelessness, and poverty in adulthood. And then looping back around to Act 125, the Family Visiting and Resource Center. You know, it's taken a lot of attempts to get this bill passed. We went through several iterations before the stars finally aligned and the universe opened up and things kind of fell into place. The idea came from one of the founding Family Reunification Working Group members whose experience with visiting as a young mother whose husband was incarcerated was as she describes it, very unpleasant, stressful, and very hard on her at the time young child. A community organization called Friends Outside, who Anne's very familiar with in California, was a great model for us to look at and to glean from. So we hope to work in this public-private partnership to successfully pilot and eventually replicate the Waiaba Family Visiting and Resource Center. All right, moving on to what do we need? And I think we'll tag team this one, Anne and I.
Yeah. So with awareness comes this assumptions and myth busting. I think I addressed that I just think we have to be careful not to use the breaking the cycle as the main reason for doing programming, but rather child well-being. And if we think about child well-being in other contexts, you know, the number one predictor of criminality is school dropout rates. And the number one group of children who are at the highest risk for criminality are kids in foster care, unfortunately. So we need to think about this population as not just to break that cycle that everybody wants to attack, but rather the child well-being issue. And then I'll do the data. Well, everybody wants numbers. I just want everybody to know, be real clear about why you want it and what you're going to do with it. If you want numbers so that you can provide services, then that means you're going to have to get names of kids and locations. So for instance, the shift from specific children of incarcerated parents program to making whole school districts incarceration friendly, so to speak. The one question that pops up every time is, well, how do we know where the kids are? How do we know who they are? How do we find them? What they will say if you bring children and families together and ask them is, if you build it, they will come. So you don't really necessarily need to know to have good services and programs. Just assume that they're all there because, as I said, they're everywhere. But if you, and also if you're asking to get that information, you're going to run into lots of problems with issues of fear of child protective services, with issues of fear of sanctions. But if you're asking just to count so that you can say our county or our island or our city has this many children with incarcerated parents, then it doesn't have to be specific. It can just be a head count without specific names and addresses, etc. So be clear why you want it. Train people to collect it if you're going to ask questions, and be sure that if you're asking in corrections, that you're not asked, that uniformed staff are not asking. Then there's a big question about, you know, early childhood programs. Do you put it on the intake forms and in schools? And there's a lot of conversation that could be had about how to do that well and ethically. All of this needs a champion. and probably more than one. So, you know, in your system, in your school district, I had a young woman who was an intern of mine, and she went on and on and on and graduate degrees and ended up as the director of student climate, or, you know, in the Philadelphia school district, and started a whole initiative on children of incarcerated parents as the champion. And now she's grooming someone to be her sort of assistant. And this issue has to be bipartisan in terms of politics, because otherwise it's just going to keep flip-flopping back and forth as the political winds shift. Well, we're concerned about safer streets and support for good policing, especially here on the East Coast. I think that conversation gets tied up with, oh, you're going to want us to do programs for the children of the people that are, you know, the bad guys. We have to find a way to engage in the conversation of, this is good support for policing, this is good for safer streets, this is good for helping children manage the trauma of separation because of incarceration. And then finally, everybody wants collaboration, and law enforcement working with schools and law enforcement working with child welfare. Again, the ethical and confidentiality issues. There's an initiative going on around the country now called Handle with Care, where law enforcement are being mandated to let a school know when there's police activity in a home without permission of the caregivers in the home. And that is causing quite a bit of debate about the ethics of it. There's some good things about getting the kids trauma-informed care in school, but there's also some real concerns about, why are we bypassing the parents? And likely the answer is that the assumption is that these are not such good parents. And that's a myth. So, you know, it goes back around. And in Hawaii?
Thanks, Anne. It was funny because Anne and I both kind of separately brainstorm on this part of it. And you'll see that it really does kind of mirror. We mirror each other in our thoughts of what's needed. So the first thing I put on my list was awareness. And similar kind of story that Anne had. I was getting my hair cut one day, and the woman cutting my hair had a sister who was formerly incarcerated and came out, and she was just livid at the fact that her sister was able to get these benefits after she was incarcerated. So I think awareness and education is key to everybody, right? Even the sister of a person was upset at this quote unquote benefit that her sister received. So awareness was top of my list. And data, same as Anne, she had data up there, same. So if you remember Act 16 that we got passed, which asks 2 questions upon intake: are you a parent, and how many children under the age of 18 do you have? I mentioned 600 was that pilot data set, but really when we took a look at the data, and Anna's absolutely correct, it really came down to who was asking the question, when they were asking the question, how they were asking the question, and even to take it as far as the intake worker understanding why they're asking the question. And so the data set that came back, we partnered with UH Center on the Family, who kind of data crunched for us, and they came back saying that it was pretty unreliable because answers were all over the map. And again, it came back to how the question was being asked, where, when, and why the questions were being asked. So there's a need, I think, for us to do a little bit of soft touch training with the intake workers to explain to them. We did one set on Kauai, and after we did the training with their intake workers there, they were like, oh, okay. And so their understanding then translates to how they, again, ask those questions to those folks coming through intake. So that's kind of on our radar as well, to go to the other islands and do some soft training with the intake workers there. Political will, I think that's an important one for us here in Hawaii. Although there is a mantra that we say that even without it, we're going to do the work. But it definitely helps to have that public-private partnership and the support of the legislature in these kind of areas. Collaboration. Kind of same, I guess, vein as political will, collaboration between public and private entities, also with stakeholders and folks with real life lived experience is also an important piece to the work that we do. And last but not least, cultural programming. We know I mentioned Pu'uhonua a while back in one of the acts that was passed, but we know that Hawaiians had systems and structures in place to address these types of things. And so why not look at how those systems work? Of course, we live in a different time and place, but we can, I think, glean from those types of values, practices, and principles that these systems offer us in this time. So moving on to now, what can I do and what can we do? I think we kind of made our list, and it came to 3 kind of broad categories, which was awareness, action, and support. And this one, Anna and I will tag team.
Before we do that, I just want to add on one tiny thing to what you said, Kupuna.
Yeah.
Tying together the cultural responsiveness and awareness and responsibility to bringing people personally impacted in on designing solutions. We know that everybody wants programming, and we also know that the programming all has to be tweaked and modified because everybody wants evidence-based practices and models, and there are very few of those designed for this population. So we take them from other places. We take them from drug and alcohol treatment and child welfare and grief support, and all of those are great. But when we have to adapt them and do training specifically for this population, why not involve those personally impacted and involve those from the culture that is primarily represented in the jail population and prison population in designing those programs? So I just wanted to mention that as a best practice.
Thank you so much. I know we are coming upon the last 6 minutes here, so maybe we can just run through this real quick and then we can open it up for some quick questions. I'm just going to put them all up there.
This is something I want, we're going to go back and forth, Kupuna and I, to just have you think about as you leave here, because it's a lot for some and it's, not so new for others. So start with taking one thing you heard today that makes you feel good about what you already do, and pat yourself on the back about what you do well.
And then think about something that maybe you want to find out more about using Google search or tapping on folks who maybe have that information or experience.
And definitely think of something you heard that you want to try that's new, or something that you heard that changed your perspective or point of view in some way.
I love this one. Something that makes you want to fight or argue, makes you mad or upset, because oftentimes those emotions is what fuel our passion and kind of fuels the work that we do.
And then think of something you want to tell someone or text someone. And often when I do this, when people text someone that's personally impacted, so they've been sitting and listening and think, oh yeah, my neighbor or my cousin.
And this was an important one. Examine bias and assumptions, your both implicit and explicit biases. Look at those, ask yourself the questions, and maybe you can make some adjustments or pivots if you need to.
And I said this earlier, if you build it, they will come. You don't have to know that they are among you. They are everywhere. Children and families impacted by the criminal legal system are everywhere. So design something, build it, get the word out.
I'm gonna let Anne do this next one because the way she explained it was just so beautiful.
So when you do data collection, if you ask to give rather than ask to get, when you're asking to get, you're asking them to give you information, like who are you, where are your kids, how old are they? But if you're asking to give, well, we're asking you these questions about your children and how old they are because we have resources that might help. So you're asking to give instead of just asking to get.
Love that. And last but not least, share resources in your office or on your website, children's books, tip sheets, etc. That's one of the easiest things that we can do to move this work forward.
And our website at the National Resource Center on Children and Families of the Incarcerated has 23 free downloadable pamphlets for caregivers and organizations. We have a state-by-state program directory and many, many, many other resources.
Yay, we did it with 4 minutes to spare. How is that? Mahalo, folks, for joining us. Any questions or comments or anything to share? You're welcome to unmute.
We did have one question in the chat, and that was, can you tell us a little more about what types of partners were on your family reunification working group?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a representative from Adult Friends for Youth. The easiest way to kind of explain it, it was folks who were already attending the Keiki caucus meetings back in that time. So we had real people with real life experiences, formerly incarcerated people. We had Adult Friends for Youth. We had the ACLU was at the table. Public safety was at the table. DHS, DOH was at the table, of course. Keiko Kaina was at the table at one point. We were meeting often at their site in Kalihi. Who else did we have? Alulike was at the table for a while. Yeah, we had a bunch of, I can send it. I have a extensive list that I have that I can send over to Maya, and she can send it out to you folks. But yeah, basically it was family programs and organizations alongside folks with real life experience, alongside public departments.
And I'm glad to hear that you had people with lived experience right there at the beginning, because one of the things we get most often about that is, you know, they try to involve people after they've already designed something, and kind of, you know, it feels like you're just bringing people with lived experience in to rubber stamp something that people without that lived experience designed, and that's typically there's a lot of resentment about that. So bringing people in very early on in the process is very important.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jan.
Are there any questions from the crowd? Go ahead and unmute and ask away.
I have a question.
Hi, Leah.
Hi, Mai. Hi, Kukuna.
Aloha.
It just, I swear it was all timing, because we got word at KPAA that we have some funding that we can use for concrete supports for children with parents who are incarcerated. So I was gonna ask like your suggestion, but it has to do, you know, like it has to be on island. So, you know, for Kauai. So I was gonna ask, where would you suggest I go to first? Because this is kind of new for me.
Yeah, good question. I would say, I guess I can admit my bias here, but we have two neighborhood places on Kauai, and that's
Yes.
Hale Ho'omalu and Nana's house or Nana's
Yes.
house.
Yes.
So I would start there.
Okay.
Auntie Dory is amazing. She knows all kind of people and all kind of things.
I love Dory.
Yeah, and then I know I'm not too familiar with this program, but I've heard good things, and I don't even know if they're still operating. But is it called Hale Opio or something like that?
Yes.
Hale Opio.
Well, Haleopio, yeah. So we do
Yeah.
Haleopio. We literally in the Haleopio building.
Oh, so funny.
See, told you it was
see,
all
yeah,
tiny, all tiny.
Exactly. You know, the other thing that at one point, I don't know which one, whether it was Hale Ho'omalu or Nana's house, but they were working with Kauai Community Correctional Center. Is that what it's called? KCCC?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were
Okay.
doing some Kamalama stuff in there and helping
Yes.
folks coming out. So maybe that might be a good reach out and see what's happening on that end.
Okay. I'm gonna check with Steph and Dory on that.
Awesome.
And then
Mahalo, Leah.
I'll go upstairs with Haleopio. See,
love it.
I get chicken skin.
Right on. No coincidences. He was meant to be here.
And Leo, one thing that if you have the funds to tandem that with working in the schools, because schools are where all the kids are.
Mhm.
And there, you know, there's a huge schools and health and mental health services are the new places that people are really looking for. They're getting training for their staff. They're looking for either low cost, no cost ways to infuse some of these ideas into schools and into mental health and healthcare services.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Good thing I jumped on.
Yeah.
We are at time. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. This will be recorded. The link is in the chat to the recording. Well, after it gets transcribed, all the links I would like to put up on the website. So if you missed a link, it'll be on the Hawaii Children's Trust Fund website. I want to mahalo you for joining us. Mahalo Kukuna and Anne for sharing your mana'o and thoughts with us. It was very much needed.
Thank you, everyone.
Folks. Yes.